Hello and welcome back to another podcast episode. My name is Rohan, your host here, and we have a lot to get to. It was a big college football Friday and Saturday. A lot of good games. It was rivalry week, last week of the regular season. So many things going on that we have to break it down here. The 12-team playoff is becoming a lot more clear, and a lot of teams are trying to play themselves in. And now for championship week, a lot of these teams are just fighting for seeding in the Big Ten, in the SEC. Some teams are not even going to play in championship week that are going to be in the playoffs, and they're just going to be looking to see, who's winning, who's losing, to see if they can up their seed. But still some spots up for grabs that we have to discuss, and I will be previewing all of that after we get through what happened in the last week of the regular season. Obviously, rivalry week, renewed rival between Texas A&M and Texas. The game, Ohio State versus Michigan, and then a Georgia Tech game that went way too long. So those are the big storylines, but we'll get into it all. So I'm going to go through all the teams that are still alive in playoff contention, and I'm just going to be discussing each team, or that, basically every team that's in the top 25 I will be discussing here. So let's get started. I'm going to go by conference. So let's get started in the American Athletic Conference, where Tulane definitely had a shot, to be in that group of five conversation, and was in that group of five conversation going into this week. Thanksgiving Day, they have a big game against a good Memphis team, but they end up losing. 24-34 was the final score. Memphis was basically in complete control this entire game, and Tulane is no longer a part of any playoff conversation. Um, it was them and Boise that were really the two favorites, but it looks like that they will not be making the playoffs, but they still have the American Athletic Conference Championship to go to versus Army, so still something to play for next week for them. Next, we're going to move on to the ACC, which was a super interesting week. You had three teams alive for playoff contention going into the week. SMU, Clemson, and Miami were those three teams. Two of them were going to make the conference championship game. It just depended on who. SMU was already locked into the championship game this week, but they fought so that even if they lose, I think, in the conference championship game, they will still make the college football playoff. They got a big win against Cal. I think it was 34-6 or something. It was a blowout, complete blowout. Next, you had Clemson, who ended up losing, but they were not playing in a conference game. So that was big, because now that we'll talk about one team, the Miami lost, that Clemson is now going to be a part of the ACC Conference Championship game. And if they win that, regardless of how many losses they have, they are going to be in. They only have one conference loss. Their two losses outside of conference were Georgia, and this week they played South Carolina, and they just had an ugly loss. I don't like Clemson. I don't think they're a contender. Their offense is not good. Cabe Klubnik has not, um, you know, played well these past couple weeks. They had South Carolina, but South Carolina is a tough team. They honestly, I think they should be in the playoffs, even though they probably aren't going to make it. But South Carolina, just a tough team. They were able to come back on Clemson, and Lenore Sellers might be the strongest dude I've ever seen at quarterback. I mean, this man was going crazy running the ball. He had 164 yards passing, but at the same time, he also had over 100 yards rushing, and the rushing really helped them because they were down 4 points. South Carolina was at their own 20. It's third and 16, or at Clemson's 20. It's third and 16. They have to get a touchdown here, and Lenore Sellers just runs it in, dragging Clemson defenders, and they are able to keep Clemson from scoring any more points, and they end up winning 17-14. That game was at 11 o'clock, so that was going on with a lot of other games, but one to take note of for sure. Even though that Clemson won, they're still going to be in because of Miami's loss, which was a huge game as well. Syracuse, one of the better teams in the ACC, took them down, and it was just surprising to see this Miami collapse. I mean, Miami was up 21-0 in the second quarter and looked like they were on their way to the ACC championship. I mean, they were probably getting prepared on the sideline, but Syracuse came back, scored 14 in the second quarter, to make it 21-14 and a half, and just outscored and outplayed this Miami team the entire second half. The final score was 42-38. Cam Ward didn't play as great as I wanted him to, but he was just down the stretch. He didn't play well, I'll be honest. And obviously, this defense didn't play well, giving up 42 points on a Syracuse team that is solid, but not a great team. And I really think Miami lost this game because of a bad unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. They were in the red zone, only first and goal, basically first and 8. They had 8 yards to go, and they contracted an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty that moved them back 15 yards. This was about with 3 or 4 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and they got that 15-yard penalty that moved them back to first and 23, and they were unable to get the touchdown, so they had to settle for a field goal in a 7-point game. So if they would have gotten the touchdown, they would have tied that game. But they never saw the ball after that. Syracuse just ran out the clock, and Syracuse got the win. But the ACC completely flipped in one day time. Going into this week, it was looking like that the ACC championship was going to be SMU versus Miami, but now it's SMU versus Clemson. One, this is huge for SMU because SMU is basically locked into a playoff spot. No matter if they win or lose, they will be in. And Clemson, so many teams are cheering for Clemson to lose because they don't want Clemson to steal a spot. Alabama, teams like Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss, all with 3 losses, are cheering for Clemson to lose because then one of them will be let in. If Clemson wins that game against SMU, the whole playoff picture is basically decided after that. There's not going to be any more at-large bids available because Clemson will take that because they won the ACC and they were one of the 4th highest ranked conference championship winners. So that's what it's really going to come down to. Miami now, with the loss, is basically officially eliminated from playoff contention, which is sad. I wanted to see Cam Ward, their star quarterback, in the playoffs and see how he did because I think they have a dynamic offense, but Mario Cristobal's defense was just horrible. This whole year, basically, they were always in shootout games, which was nice to watch, but for a team that has playoff expectations, that's not good to be in such close games every single week, and it eventually caught up to them. Now SMU can be a 4 seed if they win the ACC championship, or an 11 or 10 seed if they lose. So we'll have to see what happens. Still a big game because Clemson is trying to play their way in, and Alabama is probably the first team out. So we'll see how Clemson does. I don't think they're going to win. My score prediction is going to be 38-16 SMU, and I think Clemson falls. They aren't as dominant as they've been in the past, and I just don't think they have the firepower to keep up with a great SMU offense that's done a great job with Kevin Jennings. So that basically sums up the ACC. Next, we're going to move over to the Big Ten, which also had a big week. 4 teams alive for playoff contention. Looks like all 4 will make it after this week. Only 1 loss out of those 4 teams, which we'll get into a second. But we're going to start with Indiana, who only has 1 loss throughout the season, which was against Ohio State away from home. They played Purdue this week, basically a win and in game. If they win this game against Purdue, they are in the playoffs, and they ended up doing that handedly. They won 66-0. Next, we move over to Penn State, who got a surprise because now they're in the Big Ten championship because of one team's loss. They played Maryland, and they absolutely dominated. They look like they're on one to the Big Ten championship, obviously, but now they are definitely on their way to the playoffs. And our last team was Oregon, who already clinched a spot in the Big Ten championship before this week, but are now just playing this game just to hype up their seeding and make sure that they absolutely have a spot in the college football playoff. But they played Washington and they absolutely dominated. So 3 blowouts there in the Big Ten. And then you had the game, Ohio State, Michigan, which never disappoints. And it definitely didn't this time because Michigan got the upset win against Ohio State. It was just an awful game for this Ohio State offense, and a little bit the defense, but more the offense was just horrible. Only scoring 10 points in a game that really mattered. Your best rival, your team that's beat you 4 times in a row, and you're just going to score 10 points. It's just unacceptable. With the best receiving class in the country, 2 great running backs, and a quarterback that's experienced, you just cannot have that. Will Howard did not play well. I thought the play calling was bad for Ohio State. They ran it. This was like in the third quarter, but they ran it 3rd and 10 in their own red zone. They decide to run for it, which was a big surprise. Will Howard threw 2 picks. One led to a Michigan touchdown. The second one did not lead to much, but Michigan could have been up more because Davis Warren, Michigan's quarterback, threw a pick in the end zone. The guy was wide open, but he ended up missing him and ended up throwing a pick. So this game could have been more than a 3-point win for Michigan, but nevertheless, Ohio State's field goal unit was awful as well. I don't know if I mentioned that, but basically not chip shot, but two easy field goals missed by Julian Fleming, Ohio State's kicker, from around 30 yards. Both missed, and that would have won the game for Ohio State essentially because they lost by 3 points. Michigan in the fourth quarter was able to drive down the field and take the lead on a. They were tied, but on a game leading field goal that ended up winning them the game. Ohio State was never able to come back. They only had less than a minute to score a field goal, and they were just unable to do that at the end. But just unacceptable for Ryan Day. I mean, obviously, just bad, like I said, bad play calling, and then the roster that you've got around them, $20 million worth of NIL deals and stuff, and they were just unable to beat Michigan, who Michigan really doesn't have a passing quarterback to say. I mean, it was mostly the running game for Michigan that got them in, and Michigan's defense just played fantastic going throughout this game, and they were able to get a big run in the fourth quarter that really led to that field goal. And Michigan also has one of the best field goal kickers in the nation, so a little bit of a switch from Ohio State, who didn't have a great week on the field goal unit. But basically, with the result of Michigan winning and Ohio State losing, that puts Penn State in the Big Ten championship game versus Oregon. Ohio State will still be in the playoffs, but they will have a much lower seed than they would like. I don't even know if they'll get a home game in the playoffs. It looks like that they won't. But like I said, Ohio State with 2 losses, but the quality of wins that they have, they beat Penn State, Indiana. They played a 1-point game against Oregon on the road. So the quality of wins and the quality of even the losses that they have are not bad. They will still be in, but Penn State versus Oregon is the upcoming game next week in the Big Ten championship game. Not a lot to, no one's not gonna make it out of that game. Both Penn State and Oregon have clinched, just like Indiana and Ohio State. So all 4 teams are now in. But it's just gonna be for seeding in that game on who's gonna get that top 4 seed. If Oregon wins, they'll get the top 4 seed. If Penn State wins, they'll get the top 4 seed, being one of those 4 highest conference championship winners. But not much more to discuss with the Big Ten, like I said, with all 4 teams already in. A conference that has a lot to sort out is the Big 12. There were 4 teams going into the week that had a chance to make the play, that had a realistic chance to get to the championship game. Arizona and Iowa State were the 2 favorites. Arizona State needed a win, and then Iowa State needed a win and a couple of things to fall their way. But they were some super realistic things that could have fell their way. But we'll start with Colorado, who had one of the least chances going into the week to make the playoffs. They end up blowing the heck out of Oklahoma State. That ends Mike Gundy's, Oklahoma State's head coach, worst year as their head coach. He's been coaching for a long time there, so surprising. We'll see if he sticks around for next season. But like I said, on senior day in Boulder, Colorado was able to get the win 52-0. So they still had a shot, not a big one, but a shot going into Saturday. Then you had at 2:30 you had Arizona versus Arizona State, another rivalry, but this one was not close at all. Arizona State won, and that clinched their spot into the Big 12 championship game. So they were essentially in after that win. And then Iowa State took on Kansas State. Iowa State, a team that, like I said, needed a little bit of help, but most importantly, they needed that win against Kansas State, who was still a ranked team at the time. Probably won't be after this episode is out, after the rankings change, but still, Iowa State got the win 29-21 against Kansas State. So all they needed was one thing. They needed the late game, BYU, to beat Houston. And if BYU did not beat Houston, it would be Colorado that would be facing Arizona State in the Big 12 championship. BYU, huge favorites. They actually had a close game against Houston. Houston kept this pretty close into the second half, and where it was on a big run basically during the second half. They were able to get a touchdown, get a 2-point conversion, get the ball back, and they had a chance to take the lead with a touchdown in the fourth quarter, but were unable to do that. And that took BYU to the finish line, and BYU ended up getting the win, which put Iowa State in the playoff in the Big 12 championship instead of Colorado. So that's your championship game, Arizona State versus Iowa State. It does look like that will be the only bid. The winner of that game will be the only bid in the Big 12. So that's a winner-go-home game there. That's one that's definitely worth watching on your Saturday of college football. But it was just a huge week for the Big 12 in terms of who's going to make the Big 12 championship. And obviously, those two teams, which are the most favorited teams to make them going into the week, did end up making it. Arizona State, my score prediction is going to be that Arizona State is going to beat Iowa State. I think this game will be close for a little while, but I think Arizona State's overpowered offense with their trio of Sam Levitt, Cam Scadaboo, and Jordan Tyson, I think they'll get it done against Iowa State, as Iowa State has struggled a little bit during the season. Next, you're going to move on to the Mountain West. Obviously, Boise State, one to watch for. On Friday, they took on Oregon State, and Ashton Jeanty rushed for 226 yards in the Boise State win. They ended up winning against Oregon State 34-18. They were already in the Mountain West Championship, but they need basically to only have one loss to make it to the Group of Five, to be the Group of Five team to make it to the playoffs. And their contender in the playoffs is going to be UNLV, as they finish the season 10-2 and get a good win against a bad Nevada team. UNLV ended up winning 38-14, so that puts UNLV and Boise State in the Mountain West Conference Championship. And basically, this is another winner-go-home game. The winner is going to get into the playoffs. The loser is going to be eliminated. I don't know if UNLV has a 100% chance to make it into the playoffs with a win, but I'm pretty confident that with a win, UNLV will be 11-2 and should make the playoffs. UNLV had that big thing happen in the middle of the season with the transfer of Matthew Sluka, their quarterback, but they were able to overturn that and turn the season into a good one for them. And now they have a chance on Saturday to take on Boise State, who has not lost except to Oregon by 7 points this season. They have a chance to make the playoffs and to beat Boise State, so we'll see how that goes. I don't think they'll get it done, but I think they'll make it pretty dang close. UNLV will. I think that this game is going to be closer than a lot of people think. Boise State has a lot of offensive weapons, and I think that's what's really going to push them ahead. With Jeanty, with their good receiving core, I think that'll put them ahead, and they'll beat UNLV. Boise State will, and Boise State will move on to the playoffs. That's my prediction. I think the score will be like 34-31. Boise State wins on a field goal, a late game field goal. But a win or go home game in the Mountain West is something we don't see a lot. But with this new 12-team playoff, we do see this now. And that's what this 12-team playoff is really about. There's going to be a lot more viewers on the Mountain West Championship game because of that. Because of these teams that do still have a shot to make the playoffs and do still have a shot to win the national championship. So it's good to see that happening for these smaller teams like UNLV, which did not have a shot even if they went undefeated with the 4-team playoff. But now they end up getting a shot here in the Mountain West Championship game. So an interesting game to watch. That one will actually be on Friday before all the big games happen. But winner go home game going to be exciting for sure. Next, we move over to the SEC, which also had an extremely huge week, maybe the biggest week out of any of these conferences. We'll start on Friday night, which was the game of probably the year, to be honest. It was Georgia versus Georgia Tech. An interesting one for sure. Georgia Tech actually took a 17-point lead on the road in Georgia. At halftime, they were up 17-0 on Georgia, basically. And Georgia fought back. They were able to fight back and score a touchdown to make it 20-27 in the fourth quarter. Georgia Tech had the ball with 2 minutes left, and unfortunately Haynes King, who had played so good the entire game, ended up fumbling with the ball with 2 minutes left. That put Georgia in scoring position. They were able to tie it up, and they were able to send the game to overtime at 27-27. It was tied. This game went to overtime, or overtimes. This game just kept going. So many overtimes, and then we got to after the second overtime, it turns to 2-point conversions, and none of the teams could get any 2-point conversions to go. Georgia got one in the sixth overtime. Then Georgia Tech responded by getting a 2-point conversion back, so the game was not done yet. Finally, Georgia just ran it in and was able to win to secure their spot in the college football playoff and go to Atlanta to face the winner of the Texas A&M Texas game. But what a game this was. 8 overtimes. This is the second longest FBS game that has ever happened. The first being Illinois versus Penn State. That was just a couple years back, which went to 9 overtimes. But still just a crazy, crazy game. Like I said, Haynes King Haynes King is just, this offense was so well designed because Haynes King could either run the ball, he could hand it off, or he could pass it to one of his receivers, a short pass. So many options for Haynes King to use, and he used it during the game. But I thought the 2 point conversion play calling for Georgia Tech was just not where it needed to be. They had been so dominant running the ball the entire time, but for most of the 2 point conversions, they decided to pass, unfortunately, and that's what really let them down. I think if they were to run the ball, a couple times during those 2 point conversion plays that they had, they would have probably won. But Georgia gets the win. Like I said, that solidifies their spot. They were already in the SEC championship because this is a non-conference game going into this week. But this solidifies their spot that they only have to play for seeding in the SEC championship game. Now we'll take a look at some other teams here. You had Auburn in the Iron Bowl versus Alabama. Alabama completely dominated this game. Even with four turnovers for Alabama, they still won, and that moves them to 9-3. Still with some slim hopes of getting in the playoffs, like I mentioned with the Clemson and SMU game. That's really going to decide if they get in the playoffs. Tennessee, who all they needed was a win to secure their spot in the playoffs, they ended up getting it 36-23 against Vanderbilt. They are in the playoffs. Ole Miss, with such a long shot to get in the playoffs, but they ended up winning against Mississippi State. They call it the Egg Bowl, and they ended up winning the Egg Bowl. So a good win for Ole Miss, but it looks like they will be just a bit short for getting into the playoffs. And then the game of the week was not really the game of the week. It was the most hyped up game I had really ever seen. Texas versus Texas A&M. Just a low scoring affair here. 17-7. Texas ended up winning. That moves Texas to 11-1, and that will make them face Georgia in the SEC championship game. This was a game which was a winner go home game for only Texas A&M in College Station on Kyle Field. An exciting atmosphere, one of the best atmospheres I'd ever seen. But Texas A&M's offense did not play like that. They played horribly. One of the worst play calls I had ever seen was Texas A&M 4th and goal. They had been stopped on the run, I think once or twice at the 1 yard line. 4th and goal. They put all their personnel, all their linemen, and they ended up getting stuffed at the goal line. That was in the fourth quarter, and that basically finished up the game. They could have gone for the field goal to make it a one-possession game and to still be in the game, but that basically ended it for Texas A&M. Not too of an exciting game, a lot of defense. But that basically makes the Georgia-Texas SEC championship game an interesting one for sure. Obviously, like I said, both teams are just fighting for seeding, and that eliminates Texas A&M from any playoff contention, which Texas A&M could have been a bid stealer if they won against Texas, and then Georgia in the SEC championship game to be SEC champions, but they did not. Personally, I think Georgia is going to win against Texas. I think Texas' offense has just been a little lackluster these past couple weeks, but I think they'll get it done against Texas. So that finishes out all the conferences there. I know that might have been a lot to take in, so I'm going to break it down a little even more. So the teams that have clinched and are in are Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, Indiana, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, and then Notre Dame, which I actually forgot to talk about because they were not in any conference, but they got the big win against USC. It was a 14-point win. This game was actually close, but Jaden DeLora, USC's quarterback, just threw a couple of pick sixes, and this game was never in any fear for Notre Dame down the stretch. So Notre Dame got the big win, and that also makes them a playoff team. So that was 8 teams right there that I named, and then there's 4 other spots in the 12-team playoff. One spot is going to come from the ACC championship game, the winner of that. One spot is going to come from the Mountain West championship game, like I mentioned, and one spot is going to come from the Big 12 championship game. Now, if Clemson loses, then one more spot will become available, and that's one spot will go to Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Miami, or SMU if they end up losing. That would make 12. So hopefully that clears things up for everyone if you got a little confused throughout the episode. But that'll basically finish off the episode. The rankings come out on Tuesday. That's not the official rankings. Those are just the rankings going into championship week. But that plays a big role on who the committee thinks is the better team in terms of Alabama, Ole Miss. Like I mentioned, those bubble teams are going to be watching for sure. So thank you for listening to this podcast episode. I know it wasn't too great trying to get back into these podcasts, but thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. I'll probably have an NFL episode out this week. Goodbye.